Good evening, everybody, and welcome. And probably good morning and good afternoon to our online viewers, depending on where they're watching from. My name is Jonathan Barrett. I'm the Land Management and Access Officer for the Galloway Glens. And tonight's event is the future of woodlands in Dumfries and Galloway. We have two excellent speakers, both experts in their field, hopefully. The first is Archie McConnell, who some of you, or most of you, will actually know from the Dumfries Archive mapping project. Archie's going to be wearing a number of hats, I think, this evening: forestry, historian, economist and biologist, and no doubt others that I've not thought of. And we have Adrian Kershaw, who's the site officer for Core Head for the Borders Forest Trust. So it promises to be a really interesting set of presentations. I think we'll have the chance to take some questions from the floor after each presentation, and we'll try and deal with the online questions as we go. We'll wrap up just before 9 o'clock. So, as they say, without further ado, I'll hand over to Archie.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good evening. Do all the right things. Nice to be here and all that kind of thing. Nice to see everybody, and hello to everybody online. Right. I hope I'm going to work this. My talk is called Ways of Looking at Woodland, and we normally have specific ways in which we do that, depending on what sort of person we are, whether we're a farmer, a forester, whether we belong to ecological groups or whatever it happens to be. I'm going to try and throw as many spanners in the works as I possibly can, with the intention of getting people to try and think about things. I get very upset with people talking about ancient woods, native woods, restored landscapes and such like, because most of these words have become totally meaningless in what they actually are talking about. Okay, if anybody had missed any of that, basically I was saying that I was going to be rude to everybody, so please excuse me to start off with. Okay, let's move on. I'm going to try and give you a little bit of structure in which to think about woodland, because I think it's very necessary to do so. And basically, we are part now of a thing called the Anthropocene, as in most of you have come across the word, but essentially mankind has stuck its stamp on most things. And woodland, specifically in the UK, is exactly the same. Now, woodland's existence is the result of a perceived human need, okay? There is no other way that it exists currently. That's a big thing to get your head around to start off with, all right? Let me explain. The needs are threefold: for utility, okay, which is all the stuff that we can think about, so industrial usage, fuel, construction. When I say military usage, I mean naval usage in the old days and all that kind of stuff. The next one is for protection, okay? Ordinary common or garden shelter, watershed protection, big stuff in the US on that one, halting desertification, so you're looking at like the Green Wall in what's the name of the place? Sahara Desert and such like places. Improving biodiversity as a carbon sink, and there are other peculiar ones like as a military barrier. The third one is, I find the most fun. It's for fun, basically. Okay, for scientific endeavor, scenic splendor, and hunting, etc. And this is quite a big number as far as the trees and stuff are concerned. And especially when you talk about Sitka spruce, you are talking not about the last one, but you're talking about the first one. And when you say, I don't like Sitka spruce, you're probably talking about the last one and not the first one, okay? The other thing to think about when you look at a woodland is the proximity. This is specifically for pre-industrial era, if you like. So the proximity to the need determines the position of any individual wood. So, for instance, if you have the view out of your sitting room window and you plant some trees, the trees are going to be fairly near your window because you want them to enjoy the view, etc. Not the trees, but you're wanting to enjoy the view of the trees as they grow in the garden. Similarly, we'll come on to quite a lot of things about, what do you call them, tower houses and such like. You find that there's always a stand of oak next door to a tower house, and that's specifically for doing up the tower house. So the need determines the position of any individual woodland. Okay, dates and such like. I'm just going to talk about the modern era in D and G, but mainly the G part, okay? And we really start off in the 1690s. I'm going to look at pre-17th century. Then we'll have a quick look at the 17th century, because that was a kind of fascinating time for woodland around here and elsewhere. And then we have what I call paternalism, which is driven by the great famines of the 1690s, I beg your pardon, and then capitalization, which is when the landscape is basically starting to be put into a notebook and everything is done according to the accountants, if you like. We think that's happening these days. It was happening then. And you get people like Adam Smith interfering with Duke of Buccleuch and such like at a later date. Then the interesting phenomena that's happening today is a thing called corporatization of the landscape. And this started very specifically in 1919, when the Forestry Commission was started up. And essentially they are a state corporation, buying and selling timber and acting pretty much as a corporate unit would do. We'll come on to that in a later time. None of these particular forms of land ownership, or how you would however you want to talk about it, is particularly clever, and all I can say is that mixtures are probably the best way forward. The next thing, we're talking about castles and such like. There's very little that we can see before we start in the 17th century going on about revolutions and such like. And the only thing that we can fixedly see are, in fact, these oak plantations that occur next door to all of these buildings. You will recognize many of them. Kenmure in the middle, Thrieve on top right, Barscobe down here, Dundalk, and, come on, somebody, Earlston, thank you. And essentially, what you can tell about the woodland from these buildings is because the width between the walls was determined by the length of the timber that was available, okay? What is interesting, and we find this across Dumfries and Galloway, not just in the Glen Kens, but post-1550, the construction's post-1550, so we're talking about all of those, barring Thrieve, we find that the distance between the wall heads is somewhere less than 23 feet, 23 feet, somewhere around about there. And what we find is that the bigger constructions, like Threve, the distance between the wall head is slightly larger. Now, the reason that this is the case, very likely, is because the trees were at one time growing more closely together, and therefore they were slightly longer and not so bushy. We're pushing the boat out on that one a bit. Going on, 17th century, and its effect on trees. This is all quite fun stuff, and I haven't really delved into this enough. However, Cromwell's annexation of Scotland, can anybody remember? We know about Cromwell and all his revolution. When lands changed hands, however, what they tended to do was to asset strip. And Pepys, there's several papers on the asset stripping of the New Model Army when they took over from royalist estates. They whacked down the trees, sent them all off to the fleets and such like, and made good money out of it. Pepys's buddy John Evelyn, who wrote a book called Silver, he describes this happening quite a lot. The other thing, up this neck of the woods, we had a guy called General Monk come wandering around, and certainly up in the Highlands, he was removing woodlands specifically because recalcitrant Highlanders would hide in them, which is a classic response to revolution, really, as far as these things are concerned. Returns from various exiles, 1660s, restoration of the monarchy. That was quite fun. An interesting one here is a guy called Lockhart of Lee, who was Cromwell's ambassador to France. And when the protectorate was removed and the monarchy came back again, he decided it wasn't wise just to go straight back home again in case he got incarcerated or his head chopped off. So he went off to Venice and discovered larch trees, and he brought them back. This is the first recording of larch trees coming back to Scotland, and that was just near Lanark. With the glorious revolution of the 1680s, more locally here, we find that the Gordons get back into Earlston again, as far as I can recall, and it's maybe likely that they had brought tree seed back from Holland, etc., etc. But it's a general trend here that you have lots of people that had been abroad and were coming back again with fresh ideas of things that they'd seen out there in the wider world. And that includes trees and tree seed. Okay, the bottom line of this is that no one invests in long-term projects during times of instability, so no tree planting. We are talking then, I would reckon, somewhere around about 1% tree cover in this neck of the woods, possibly less, especially when you take the arable counties, arable parishes further to the south of here into consideration. It's highly likely that it's not going to be terribly full of woodland at that particular point. Okay, where were the woodlands at this time? At the end of the 17th century. Let's have a quick look at this. The little yellow dots are, roughly speaking, the ones that I want to talk about. I shall do so in a sentence for each. The two dots on the far map here is the Cree woodlands. They are very much well-renowned. They appear in Simpson's description of Galloway in what was it, 1684. He and a guy called Robert Sibbald did a whole lot of writing together, and a lot of people elsewhere in Scotland were also doing it too, which was essentially trying to be a first statistical account that never quite got off the ground. So we know about that these were woodlands that were in operation as industrial woodlands in 1684. And so we know that they would go back then at least, say, 150 years, and they've probably been there for much longer than that. We also have a note from Simpson that Bargorley, down the bottom here, is also of that era, but I like that particular one because there's a guy called Andrew Heron who buys that place in 1695, I think it is, or he's given it in 1695 by his father, and he becomes the foremost botanist of his day and brings huge numbers of different kinds of trees and plants into the area at that point. Up here, this lot of woodland here at Elliot, on the south side of that main road, or the Western Railway as it's marked there, is some of the more ruthlessly used woodland, if you like, because this is the stuff that went up into the mines at One Rock Head, if you can see just in the top right there. And we also have a note about I can't remember the name of the place now, it's Ryland or whatever the name of the place is on the other side of the road, where there are no trees now and haven't been for a very long time, but we do have a record of a woodland contract there in the 17th century. So, and Sibbald, when he was writing about the Elliot Woods, was complaining because they weren't well enough kept up and weren't enclosed from cattle and such like. If we go here, we are. Oh yes, this is the woods near Dunscore. We know about these because the mid-steeple in Dumfries was built of oak in 1704. Okay, and this is one of the places that they looked for oak, was at Burke Bush and Steelston, as marked there. Other interesting things about this map is the fact that we've got Lincluden at the bottom of the cairn where it joins the Nith, and it seems to me that this is a place that's been used for timber for a very long time because Lincluden was the monastery, monkery, nunnery, whatever it was at that point, and you have transit of timber coming down. So it's geographically very correct. The other thing that we also know is that at Cluden Mill, which is about halfway down the cairn there, there is a note of a sawyer working there in the 1660s. So we know that this was a transit point for timber. Okay, on the left-hand side, we have the woodlands down near New Abbey. That's the Shambly ones, which started very early in the 18th century, if not in the 17th, and carried on from strength to strength, mainly specializing in pine, which was an interesting phenomena, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And further north there, we have the Maybe Forest, okay, which goes back to, again, the monks, and I can't remember the name of the, no, it's gone. The name of the monastery, which was in northern England, it still is, Holmcultrum is the name of the place, and they had lands over here, and maybe is mentioned for sticking their pigs and sheep and everything else in. The other side is at New Galloway, which is pretty good. Sorry, I think we'll just have a quick look. Yeah, the New Galloway one's here. The top one there is Earlston, which we'll talk more about. And then also in Simpson's account of Galloway, at least the version that I looked at firsthand, which was at Edinburgh University, and I'm not sure if it was Simpson, but it was certainly somebody who wrote at the same sort of time, which was around about 1684. We're looking at Kenmure, the bit at Hensel there down the bottom, and also other ones that get mentioned in the same page are the woodlands at Shermers and at Trehwain, oddly. The Trehwain one I do find odd, because there's no movement of timber off that one. Sorry, this is a map of Earlston, 1769, but we can date these woodlands back quite far, in the sense that we have fir at the top. It says Fir Park, and that is interesting. When they say fir, they probably mean pine, and we do know that it was pine at that particular place. This is mentioned in the statistical account in 1793, and the fir at that point is called venerable. Now, how old in 1793 you've got to be called venerable, I'm not really very sure. But let us assume it was planted pretty much at the beginning of the 18th century, or probably sometime before that in the 17th century, so 16 something or rather. And I like to think that perhaps the Bull of Earlston himself, when he left the jails and such like, he was the great covenanter and all the rest of it, actually brought seed back from Holland or something, or had one of his connections send seed from Holland. But whichever it was, that plantation had been going on. And there are still some pine trees in that particular area, probably from that same set of seed. The rest of it there, it is pretty mixed woodland, as far as we know, but they definitely majored in oak. There's all sorts of, this is the picture that I was giving you this is the one that I was thinking about in terms of paternalism. And what you can see in the picture is you've got all sorts of things going on, like there is a potato park. So we're talking about fresh new croppings that are coming in. The first potato crop was in 1738 in Stirlingshire. So this is still fairly modern. If they had a potato park, no wonder that it got diseased if they were cropping on the same place all the time. But we'll let that one rest. There's other things too that get my notice, particularly the pigeon house, which is you can just see in the middle there, and down below you have orchards, and most importantly you have a gardener's house and a gardener's farm. Now the gardener in those days, which we're talking middle of the 18th century, was not just the guy who grew the cabbages. The gardener was the forester as well. He grew all the trees in the nurseries, set them out, made sure they got in the ground properly, and looked after them after that. So we're talking about a place here that is obviously looking to build its ambient goodwill, if you like. It's trying to produce lots of stuff for its folk around and about. On the left there, we have the first map that I've ever seen that looks like General de Gaulle. But apart from that, this is Waterside, which is going to get covered up in woodland shortly. So I thought it was appropriate to show. On the far side is the 1815 version, 1768 on this side. Now, the big thing here is that we have woodland here. Now, this isn't just arbitrary woodland. I think this is very specific woodland, mainly because down at the bottom of each one in the waterside compartment, if you like, not in the upper Cavan or the Hanniston bit, it's called hag wood. And a hag was a division. And you would only divide your wood up if you were actually going to utilize it. So it's highly likely that these what we're looking at here is industrial woodland. It's not just something that happens to be arbitrarily there. And I would say that it's the same for most of the Earlston woodland. Carrying on, sorry, but what we were looking at there was the capitalization of landscape. So we're talking about things being worthwhile having so that you can trade them out with your environment. And that's really what the nubbins was as far as those woodlands were concerned. It wasn't probably for home consumption. We're talking about tan bark, and we're talking about perhaps charcoal later on, but certainly the tan bark, and certainly the usage of timber for various things. Here is Achy Bush. So down the bottom left-hand side is the Ken Bridge, just to get yourself acquainted. And this is off the National Library of Scotland's website, where you get a side-by-side view, which is always fab and it's great fun. What I want to point out is the small roundels on the left-hand side picture, which are probably for shelter. I was talking to our shepherd about these, and he reckoned that they were definitely for shelter. You see them again and again and again throughout Galloway, where you get a little top knot of beech trees stuck on the top of a hill, and that's the top knots on the top of the hill stop the snow from blowing around, and the sheep can always get in one place or another. The other aspect of these is probably they were also for shooting and such like. So we're talking about semi-fun on these ones. But the other thing to mention on this particular map is how, or the pair of them, is how woods move around. So you can see on the one side there are specific roundels of wood, and on this side there's a big splurge. So things change, and things always do change. Okay, big time, 1860s. This is really important time, and people just don't figure this one out. This is when all import duties came off. Okay, by 1860, all the import duties came off, which means there was a nosedive in the commitment to forestry in the UK. Up until this time, for the previous century and a half, there'd been a steady growth in planting and new planting, and that was driven by protectionism, and specifically for oak, and specifically for, what do you call those things? Specifically for oak, for tan bark. Okay, this lot here, this is just Quebec, just to show the different sizes of timber you might get in different places. Okay, and this is Quebec in 1870s or so. And by this time, the UK was certainly the biggest importer of woodland, of wood into in the world at the time. Here, this gives a good demonstration. This is Barscobe, just up the road. And on the left-hand side is the first OS map. And on the right-hand side is the second. And you can see how much the tree cover has disappeared. This is no coincidence. There was no incentive to keep it there because prices had dropped. And I would say that, especially with our current crop of monkeys in Parliament, we will probably find that they will have, they will play around with various things, and we will discover that they will take off grants or put them on or whatever, which will just make it difficult for everybody to continue doing whatever they're doing. Sorry. Okay, let's spring on. No government interference at all. Now we come on to 1919. This is Forestry Commission. This, as I was saying, is the first corporate unit, if you like, that came onto the landscape, literally. And of course, the 1947 dedication scheme was the other thing for as far as private woodland was concerned. There are lots of things that I liked about the Forestry Commission in those days, especially the way they tried to keep people on the land, and including things like small holdings, nurseries, and they directly employed some 800, 900 people in its heyday in Galloway. They've wiped all that out now. That was probably Maggie in the 1980s. This is not particularly clever kind of stuff. This is pretty much pure Sitka spruce. We can't grow it very much because it can go up to 23 meters and then it blows down, essentially. Then we plant it again. This is a new lot. Oh, well, you know all the arguments about all that sort of stuff. I'm just going to press on. This is what I don't like, though, is that it comes in and what it happens is that everything becomes totally static. There's no through flow between one land block and another land block. There's no animals moving through apart from your deer or your foxes and such like. There's no migration, if you like, between one land mass and another. Just to take a rundown of all the corporate people, I do include what I call nature corporations like Woodland Trust, RSPB, and other local trusts, as well as all the main culprits there, because they have exactly the same kind of, they're not looking at the wider part of the landscape. It tends to be much more a fence round, and this is what we do. Going down the list, you can see all the rest of things. Windmills and dams are other things that we see on our current landscape. I've got to really hurry now. Okay, varieties of landscape environment. There's a whole bit here on the dynamics of landscape. Generally speaking, we don't talk about this in the UK, they do in France. We've got to up our game. This is a hill farm configuration where you can actually see the movement between various blocks, which include meadows, arable, and the hill. Current migrations include fish and, what do you call these things? Geese. Okay, and, but the big migration that we used to have has disappeared. We used to have what I would call a pseudo-migration, which was the droving of cattle, which came basically through this spot and went straight over the top of the hills and encouraged things like all the waders and such like things, and that this all no longer happens. I don't know why. Well, I do know why, but there's other things we can do about it. This is just as though that transhumance was also the other thing that the pattern we used to have. This is probably from about 1450, and the three Douglas guys and their cattle. And just to finish up, this is what I like to see is cows in woodland. And I think there's room for everything, quite frankly. Okie doke.
Thank you, Archie.
Could I just say that if you do Google YouTube Silver Symposium and have a look for ancient woodland symposium talks, which we had to do with previously, you'll get more information on all this sort of thing, including me and the Woodland Trust and the Forestry Commission and all sorts of other people. Thank you.
Right. So, a fascinating insight there into I think the impacts of man's behaviour on the historic development of forestry as both an industry and, I suppose, arguably a horticultural activity, right up to the present day, to the corporatisation of forestry, which we're seeing happen all around us now, and we're starting to see the economic impact, particularly in some of the more traditional activities in Dumfries and Galloway, particularly the impact on hill farming, I would argue. Right, do we have any questions from the floor? A question?
I assume.
I think you'll probably be required to answer these, Archie.
Of course, if we go back before humans started to mess around with the native vegetation, and there's plenty of evidence in this area from the pollen diagrams, which Hilary Burks did, then we have a very strong native woodland species mix. What do you think, therefore, we ought to be doing? Because what you haven't said in terms of the future, you've painted a picture as if what's happening now is right. But there are messages
I didn't mean to do that.
Well, that's how I took it. Because we're preparing for another event all of Friday where we're looking at Galloway Woodlands futures in Dalry. That's a prompt for people, just come and visit us. What lessons can we learn from what was naturally here as opposed to what we've invented to come here?
Right, the first thing that probably, let's, that is actually a big question. It's not just a simplistic one. The first part of that is that I get very distressed when people call, say that nature is over there and us humans are over here. We are actually a part of nature, whether we like it or not, unless we came from a different planet, which I don't think we did. But so from that point of view, yes, it is an what did you call it? Anthropogenic way of looking at things, okay? But I think that we have to view ourselves as being within nature, because we have so much influence over what it is that is out there. We have really got to up our game to figure out exactly what kind of landscape we want to see. And I don't think that going back to something previous is correct. I don't approve of this idea of landscape restoration when we're not told what we're restoring it to. We're just told this is how it's going to be. I don't disapprove of some of the things that are going on. That's totally different. But I do disapprove of the idea that we are going to restore something when we don't actually know what it is that we're restoring it to. And just because you've got the pollen samples, which from what I have read about pollen samples, they're kind of a little bit free and easy with how you decipher them. And the long and the short is, I don't think we should be going back to something. You can't say we've been mucking around, because unfortunately, I like being a human. I'm not, I think it's not a bad idea. And I actually like quite a lot of humans, but there's the good, the bad, and the ugly you get. So, let's go with it. So we are here, and we've got to do what's best as we see best, okay? But going backwards is not a way to go. Sorry, I've used up all that time.
Fine, actually. No, I think we have a question from one of our online viewers, which I suspect is probably far more easily addressable in far fewer words. And that is,
okay.
why are the separate areas on the Ulster map named as parks?
Generally speaking, a park is an emparkment. So it's basically it's something with a wall around it. Simple answer to that one.
Easy one then.
Yeah.
Right.
Definitely.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Archie.
Okie doke.
Right, so we'll move on now. We've got the next speaker is Adrian Kershaw, who's, as I said earlier, was the site officer for Core Head for Borders Forest Trust, and Adrian is going to bring us right up to date, I think, with one of the biggest and most well-known, and I've got to be careful with my choice of words here after what Archie said, but in terms of, I'll say landscape restoration, or I could say forest restoration. There, I've annoyed him on 2 counts, which is what Core Head represents. It's probably as I said, the most well-known and probably the scheme with the greatest longevity in this area in terms of landscape and/or forest recreation, depending on your preference. So over to Adrian.
Thank you. Well, hello everyone. So my name is Adrian, and I'm just actually going to launch straight in, really based on sort of that last little bit of questioning there, and not challenge the idea of ecological restoration, because it is very much what we do at Borders Forest Trust. But what we also do, we were just talking there about humans and humans being part of the landscape and part of the ecology. Well, that's what we do. So Borders Forest Trust, as a small charity, where we're seen as an organisation that plants trees, and we do that. We do a lot more than that. We create flower meadows, we create wetlands, we restore peatland. But one of our key principles, one of our founding principles, is that we involve people in that. So we involve people in terms of volunteering and in groups and a wide range of things. We try and reach as many people as we can, educationally, but just engaging them. And what we do is ecological restoration, for sure. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk just a little bit about Borders Forest Trust, because this isn't an advert for us, but it's just to talk a little bit about what we do, what I do specifically. I'm going to move on to sort of discussing why we do what we do, and how we do it, which is involving lots of different people. I'm also going to touch on something around community consultation, because I was involved in a very big community consultation in establishing a native permanent Scottish woodland, which actually it was a fairly challenging process. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that as well, and then finish just with a look at kind of perhaps where forestry is going, commercial forestry, where it should be going, but where Borders Forest Trust and organisations like us are seeing ourselves in the future, how we're evolving and changing. So I'll start a little bit about my role. So I'm a site officer, which means I look after Core Head in the Devil's Beef Tub. It's a 640 hectare site. And I'm also engagement officer. So I get to do things like this. I get to take lots of groups out. I am fortunate enough to sometimes appear on the TV and in local papers, and so I'm the face of BFT on a lot of occasions. But my role's diverse. So today I've been up high in the hills, 4 miles north of Moffat, around the Beef Tub, planting montane scrub. So some downy willow, some dwarf birch, across some quite steep slopes. But I haven't been there on my own. I've had 5 volunteers with me, people who come out with me more or less every Wednesday and help me do jobs like that. So I've had them with me today. And I've also had a group of students from the Barony College, so the SRUC. We have a long-standing relationship with them, and they like to send their students out to spend time with us, learn about what we're doing, but also get involved, get their hands dirty. So they've been helping me plant trees. And those montane scrubs, we've planted 345 trees today. So for me, when we talk about engagement and we talk about restoration and we talk about biodiversity, for me, getting 345 trees in the ground today is a good step. That seems like a great thing, and people have been involved in it. It's only 345 trees, but it's not just about that. It's about the people being there and enjoying being there, being part of the landscape themselves, and starting to feel that ownership for what they're doing. And the more people we can reach like that, I think that's the best thing for the future. Tomorrow, conversely, I'm meeting with our forestry contractor to discuss progress on a planting scheme also at Corehead, which is 90,000 trees. So very different to what I've been doing today. So that's overseeing work on the hills there, creating a native woodland, a permanent native Scottish woodland, one that won't be felled, that won't be touched, which will be accessed by people and used by the wildlife. It should be there for all eternity. So 90,000 trees. So whereas today we're using little planting spears and getting 345 trees in the ground, tomorrow it's about diggers doing inverted mounding. A completely different thing. So Borders Forest Trust, this is the land we currently own. So although we're called Borders Forest Trust, most of our land holdings are in Dumfries and Galloway. So we have Cryfron, which a lot of people have heard of. So it's in the bottom right as you're looking at it. That was our first site, which we got. We started planting there in 2000. Connected to that is Taller and Gameshope, our largest site. And then my site, which is Corehead. And I say my site because I do feel a certain ownership for it. 640 hectares. We've got lots of different work going on there at the moment. Apart from the planting, we're putting in wildlife scrapes and lots of other work. So I'm site officer there, I'm engagement officer for all of those sites. But we're not just about the land that we own. It's great to own this land, and we're buying more land. We've actually just bought more land around Corehead, joining. Actually now we own the whole of the beef tub, where we used to own about 2/3 of it. So we are trying to acquire as much land as we can. But this isn't us in isolation. So we have a team of staff. And we have an education officer who works specifically with schools, school groups. She takes them out. She works predominantly in the borders, as in the Scottish border county. Education officer. We have a woodland officer who helps people who might have small areas of land and want to have grants and need grants to plant with trees. So she helps them get the grants. She'll help them survey the ground, see what they should plant, help them go through the application process. We have a newly appointed project officer who's helping us deliver the Destination Tweed project on our land. And we have a further engagement officer, so similar to what I do, but she works across, again, in the Scottish borders. But she works on other people's land. So whereas I work on our land, she works on land owned by other people and takes volunteer groups out to there. So in terms of why are we doing what we do, familiar scene, and I feel kind of in the room, most people are probably going to preempt what I'm saying, but what we have is essentially a denuded valley. There's very little there. You can see there's commercial forestry. There's very few trees, just small pockets, when it would have actually at one time all been woodland. This is actually the Grey Mare's Tail. Some of you might know it. Before I worked for Borders Forest Trust, I actually worked there as a ranger. We'd like to see that change. This is Cryfron, before we started planting trees. So again, barren hillside, beautiful in its own right. And this is sometimes the challenge that you're up against, that people see that and say, well, that is lovely. What a fantastic view. But it isn't how it should look. Poor quality picture, I know, but this kind of, for me, shows kind of the southern uplands where you have commercial forestry and you have wind farms. The landscape is changing, the land use is changing. And then we have, of course, sheep. But interesting, on that picture, there's some wild goats as well. You know, controversially, the goats do eat the trees and can't really be around new plants. But, you know, they're considered, although they're non-native, they're considered a wild animal. Lots of people like them. So is this what we want, these sort of hills, or do we want this? So that's Cryfron, being planted. An oak woodland, ancient woodland just outside of Moffat, Bluebell Wood. Do we want this? It's a footpath through Cryfron. I mean, I think we want this. I'm not going to go on about the carbon. When I'm saying about why are we doing it, yes, I don't want to see these denuded hills, I want to see those woodlands. But we can't ignore the fact that creating woodlands certainly will have an impact on climate change, will help address those problems. And this was done down in the Lake District, and clearly shows peat is storing the most carbon, and then after that, not much after that, is woodland. And other things have its place as well. Really talking about carbon is a whole discussion in itself, I feel, and I don't really want to go into it too much. But I will talk briefly about this, sheep and sheep farming. Sheep farming certainly is under threat. It's getting pushed out. We see land there where there's been sheep farming is now being used for something else. I think it's probably true here as it is across around the Moffat area where I live. Lots of sheep farms are being bought up by commercial forestry companies, and they're planting trees. We're also buying some of that land though. The prices have gone through the roof because of commercial forestry having the money to pay a fortune for the land. We're still buying land, but it's costing us a lot more than it was even 5 years ago. So sheep farming is being pushed out. I think the point I want to make is that we've come under criticism as an organisation for threatening a way of life through what we do. The culture around sheep farming, the hills have always had sheep on them. But nobody's forcing the farmers to sell the land. They're following where the money is, and giving up the sheep farms, which they may consider their heritage, but rather than continuing with it, they're selling to organisations like us and to commercial forestry. So it's a complex issue. It isn't as simple as saying we have all these people coming in and rewilding, or we have all these commercial forestry people coming in and making money off the land in that way. People are willingly selling their land. So how do we achieve what we achieve? So this is a small group of volunteers, some of whom come out every week. So in Borders Forest Trust, we have volunteers out every week on a Tuesday, a Wednesday and a Thursday, once at each site. And there's sort of between 5 and 6 people every time on those days. And that's every week throughout the whole of the year. And we see the same faces most weeks. People start very quickly to have ownership for the land. They want to know what's happening next. They want to look back at what they've done. They like to watch the trees growing. So we're heavily depending on these volunteers and love having them. So they're individuals. Then we also have groups come out and help. So this is actually our core head on quite a Dreek day. And these people all work for Rabbies, the coach company, the tour company. Lots of organisations now are getting giving back days. I'm sure some of you will have heard of that, where the employer is actually paying them to have 2, 3 or 4 days a year where they can go out and volunteer, but they're still paid as a staff member. So I've lots of contacts now with organisations who do that, and people come out en masse. So this is Rabbies. They're all on a giving back day, and they've been helping me take tree tubes off. We have Network Rail come out and do the same thing. But we also have some corporate groups as well, some big groups. We have Bailey Gifford, who is a big sponsor of ours. They help us a lot, and they have teams of people coming out. We're going to have Walter Scott coming out soon as well, another big organisation. So we have other types of groups as well, larger groups. We have school groups. So this is Moffat Academy. They try to get each year group out once a year to come and see what we're doing at Core Head. And we involve them. These are primary age children. So with them, it's a lot about playing games, but we try and have a sort of educational role as well. You know, one of the main things we do with the smaller children is we have them make little clay models of animals. Now we ask them to describe the animal. We ask them to say, well, what does this animal eat? Where does it live? As you go around the group, when you get to somebody halfway around, when you say, what does the animal eat? They'll go, oh, eats that animal, pointing to somebody else's clay model. And they're starting to make connections about ecology in a way that isn't sort of forced down the throat. It kind of is everyone needs somewhere to live. Everything needs somewhere to live, and everything needs something to eat. And it's, you know, how do we mesh all this together? So to teach ecology in a very gentle way. Some of the older groups want to know a bit more about the science, or the geographers and so on. And and that's our cabin at Core Head that we built from larch that we felled. That's a great resource for us to have on a wet day, especially. That's another group. That's the Out There Award, group that is based in Edinburgh and Glasgow. It's young people 18 to 25 who don't have much experience of being in the outdoors. And they come to us for a weekend and we teach them about responsible wild camping. And they get involved in volunteering and they learn about what it's like to be outside. And the very first one we did, middle of the night, my tent was rattled. It was, somebody, Adrian, so I came out not knowing what was going on. And she was saying, what's that? What's that noise? And it was just an owl, but you'd never heard an owl before. And it had scared her. And for me, that was a lesson, really. I didn't really think how much they weren't used to where they were. So now we have these groups coming out several times a year and camping at our cabin. And that is Extinction Rebellion, one of our biggest weekends. Not everybody is there. This is at Taller and Games Hope. We had over 100 people throughout the course of a weekend camping and planting downy birch for us. This is to give you an idea of kind of small-scale planting. So we have our woodland officer who helps people get grants. And this is an example of kind of how something like the South of Scotland tree planting grant can work. You may have heard of it. It's where it's planting for areas smaller than 1/4 of a hectare. You can get up to £1,000. It's not a great deal, but it's getting people involved and it's getting people using their land in a different way. It could just be a small paddock that they have somewhere that they want to plant some trees, and it's about this really. It's about a parent and a child to plant the tree. It's a great way to do that. These are a couple of people who received a tree box off us. So this is another way we try and reach people. Every year around about this time, we do a big tree giveaway. So people can apply to us for trees. They can apply for 1 tree. They can apply for 50 trees. If we've got enough, they can apply for 100 trees. And we give them the trees, all Scottish native trees. We give them the stakes and the guards, whatever it is they might need. And they plant them up. During COVID, we still operated it, but we actually delivered all the trees. Travelling all around the county, dropping the trees off in our van. And the next couple, this is Martin and Sophie. So they've received their tree box. This was a few years ago. This was during COVID. They enjoyed having the trees. They own some land, and they've now moved on to planting a whole area of woodland in a field that was rented out, and now they're filling it with 2,500 trees. Which I think it's a nice story. They've kind of thought about it. They've got some land. They've had a few trees and thought, we want more trees. We want to do more with this. And of course, we helped them. The FT've helped them. They got the planting plan. I went to see them. I gave them a bit of advice how to plant the trees, and just a few tips and pointers. Lent them some tools. Again, a fairly poor quality photo, but this is Gallow Hill outside of Moffat, a community woodland. It was owned by Annandale Estates. They clear-felled it, didn't want to replant, sold it to the community very cheaply. I'm actually a trustee there. BFT gave advice on planting, and it's now been fully planted. It's only about 30 acres. It's an amenity woodland, I suppose you would say, walking distance to the town centre. People walk their dogs there and take their kids up there. And it's a really nice spot to be. It's not been without its challenges. Some local people have kind of objected to things that are happening there, but we've kind of got over them. So this is consultation. So those 90,000 trees, if you go right back to the start of my presentation, I was saying tomorrow I'm meeting a contractor about planting the 90,000 trees across the hillside. So that work has started now, but we had to consult on that. Which is quite right and proper, and we did. And this was the local newspaper, views sought on beef tub proposals. So we did it online. We had paper copies in the newsagents, asking people's opinions, what they thought about us planting trees. We weren't actually planting in the beef tub. We're planting towards the beef tub. And we started to get a lot of responses, and 90%, closer to 95% were actually really positive about what we were doing. But this was the next thing in the paper, planting plan outcry. Now, bearing in mind we're establishing a native woodland, we're not talking about rows of Sitka spruce. We're talking about a beautiful Scottish woodland. There's a very small minority of people who objected to what we were doing, but they were very vocal. So the next week in the paper, it's this, planting plan outcry. Worrying about the views, worrying about accessibility. All of these things were addressed now. Worrying about the Wi-Fi signal was another one. Concerned about the sheep. We had sheep on that hill and we were taking the sheep off. We only had 300 ewes. It was an experiment to see if you could establish a new woodland alongside sheep farming, and you can as long as you've got fences. That was really the conclusion. So we took the sheep off Moffat, the big sheep town, but we actually got objections about removing the sheep from as far afield as Northern Ireland. I mean, this is the beauty or the curse of the internet, I suppose. So planting plan outcry. This was a sign on my barn at Corehead, which was vandalised during the consultation. So keep in mind we're planting a native woodland. So this forest is a disgrace, and BFT should hang their heads in shame for the despoilation of this beautiful area that has remained unspoilt for centuries. BFT, home of landscape and cultural vandalism on a grand scale. And that was us wanting to put a hillside back to what it used to be. You know, and the beef tub itself it has a rich history. And people talk about the history as if it's always been a barren bowl created by hills. That's what it is, the tub. It's basically 3 hills that form this tub shape. It's always been like that. Well, it hasn't. But the history associated with it is about people hiding in there. So the border reivers used to hide cattle in there. That's where it got its name, Devil's Beef Tub. So they used to take the cattle and hide them in the beef tub. William Wallace was there with the first army he gathered before he attacked the English. He hid there because his sister was married to the Laird of Corehead. Then the Covenanters were hiding there as well. They could only hide there because it was a forest. So the history that people were saying we were destroying, no, we've gone back to how it used to be, not the sheep farm that it had been for 300 years. And then the press had a change of heart. There were MPs became involved who largely sat on the fence, I would say. But once it was clear that we had a huge amount of support for what we were doing, it culminated actually in an appearance on Border News. The Save the Beef Tub group that was formed to oppose us asked Border News to come out to Corehead. So they interviewed them and said how terrible it was what we were doing. Then interviewed me and I said how great it was what we were doing. And I explained why we were doing it. You know, I was saying these people who are objecting, the grandchildren aren't going to thank them for trying to put a stop to these sort of plans. And anyway, the piece on Border News led to a big spike in support for us. So it had the opposite effect to what the Save the Beef Tub group had wanted, and then led to this as well. Trust makes a plan for the next decade. And you won't be able to read that, but that's very positive. It's saying, this is great, this is what we're doing. And they've also put at the top, tree comes 11th in the Euro contest. So that's one of our trees at Cryfron, which it's a Rowan tree, and it won the award for the best Scottish tree. And it came 11th in Europe in the same competition. And they've decided to highlight the two together. So everything, it's kind of just switched on its head, really. It was an interesting time. And I think we learned a lot from it as an organisation. But it won't stop us consulting. You know, we absolutely need to do that. So this is what we're used to, commercial forestry. That's what it looks like close up, as we know. Very little going on there, really, to my mind. Then it gets felled and becomes that. Necessary in some ways. I think Scotland is seen as the powerhouse of timber production in the UK, isn't it? I hear that phrase a lot, but we still import most of our timber that we use, don't we? But if people are going to continue to consume wood the way they are, then this is what we need. So Forestry Commission and different forestry organisations are saying, we're changing, we're going to do things differently. So that's doing things differently, maybe. A little bit of native planting around the edges, possibly poorly looked after, I might suggest. Fencing some areas off, not for planting, where things will start to regenerate. More native planting on land that is owned by a commercial organisation, but they want to plant some native trees. I suppose it's progress of sorts. But we're also changing, Borders Forest Trust. So this is Cryfron, our first site, so 2000 before we'd done anything with it. 2014, now. And Cryfron's well known, and there's 2 books been written about it. The guy who started it all, Philip Ashmole, great man, has written books about the whole process of establishing this, and he's known worldwide, and I think Cryfron is very well known. But Cryfron was always envisaged to be a place for nature, and for that reason it's just got a small car park. It hasn't got a network of paths through it. It's got a circular trail where you can go around, you can have a lovely view down the whole valley. There's still a bit of a quad ride runs through it if we need to get into it, but it's not saying to people, everybody come here please and walk around and have a look. This is great. We have special interests groups come out, and we give tours and so on. And these trees will never be touched. This is a permanent native woodland. And it's great in its own right. And BFT will continue to do projects like this. But we're changing as well, and looking to the future, we're planting these 90,000 trees now at Core Head, but we've just bought some more land, as I said earlier. We're going to be looking at that a little bit differently. So the majority of it will be a native Scottish woodland permanently there for all eternity. But we're going to do a little bit of commercial forestry in there. Not that we feel we'll make any money from it, certainly not short term, but it's to say, is this actually the future? Could this really be the future if we're going to continue to need wood? So we're going to not experiment, we're going to do it in a larger scale than that, but we're intending to have some deciduous trees for harvesting. So some oaks and other hardwoods, just small areas, and they won't be planted in the same way an ordinary commercial forest is. It'll blend into the landscape, it'll look right, it'll be thinned, it won't be clear felled. We'll approach it in a very sensitive way, but at the end of it, there will be some sort of a product. And maybe that is the future. Maybe it isn't this kind of pure vision. Perhaps we do need to start thinking about a mix, and I think as an organisation, we'd be wrong not to try that. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Adrian. That's a really interesting insight, a fascinating insight even into the ups and downs of modern forestry restoration, and exemplifying the ups and downs of community consultation. What happens when you actually go out and talk to people about your aims and aspirations? And I think I was particularly pleased to hear you placing some emphasis on the threat to, as I talked about, traditional activities, particularly hill farming, which is a core activity in Dumfries and Galloway, and is, hill farms are being lost at a rate of knots at the moment. And I particularly love the idea of the giving back days as well. That was an excellent initiative. And thank you very much for the gentle plug for the South of Scotland Tree Planting Grant Scheme as well, which the Galloway Glens has been driving for the past 2 years. So, any questions from the floor? Oh, question.
Thanks very much. I was really interested to know if you've got plans in the future, if you're talking about maybe planting productive broadleaf, or do you have plans for people actually living on the land? Because when you talk about people, they seem to be involved on a work basis, that they come into work or they come in to volunteer and then they go home. And like Archie said, in 1920, the Forestry Commission kind of was, still considered humans as part of the forest, and they had small holdings. Are you starting to see that could potentially be a model where people could actually live and steward and do coppicing and actually live in the woodlands? Because at the moment, everyone seems that you go and visit a woodland and then you have to leave unless you own the land.
I think that will be a natural evolution over time. Where we're starting thinking about that is our newest employee is going to be looking along the idea of having apprenticeships in kind of rural skills and things like that. So getting that kind of community involvement, well, it's not really even community involvement. It's more land use by individuals, but for the greater good, really. And I think that will naturally have to be part of new woodlands. I think we will need to certainly consider that. As an organisation, we've steered away from structures on the land, and any sort of infrastructure at all. Going back to Cryford, that was very much the model there. But there's scope on our new sites to have other things happening, because there's such a lack of skills, rural skills, traditional skills, but not even just traditional things that actually we do need. So people who can repair the dikes for us, people who can lay hedges, all of that kind of thing. If we try and find someone who can do that, it's really difficult. So the idea of having somebody trained to do that and perhaps being permanently on the land as a steward, I think is very attractive. And longer term, I think that will come as part of the process.
Right. Yeah, question?
More an observation than anything else, but sort of building on that point. I do think sometimes when we talk about the loss of sheep farming and such, like, if you scratch away at what's at the root of that, it's the rural depopulation and the loss of people living in the area and the loss of communities. So I think sometimes if you think about how do you replace that feeling of community, I think you might have a better solution than actually thinking people want to retain sheep farms.
Yes, I take the point. I mean, it's something that I do come across quite a lot. It's surprising the number of visitors that we have who have had some connection with the land in the past, and shepherds who have once worked on the land that we now own. And they describe a time when a particular hillside, there'd be 2 shepherds employed full time. Now, on that particular hillside, we have more people employed connected with it than that. And actually, when you talk to the shepherds, they didn't just look after this hillside, they looked after that one and the one beyond. And I think the idea that the sheep farming was providing a huge amount of employment isn't accurate. But I think it was something about the community. And going back to the lady's point there about having stewards for the land, in some ways that could replicate that.
Yeah, so my question kind of like links both of them, and also to Archie's talk earlier. Like, so what are you trying to regenerate towards, or to, or back to, or and so the question being, are we going like pre-human occupation of the land here, or are we going toward, because, and then since then, so as soon as humans arrived, we've been using the land, using for like woodland and stuff. So where, that's my, where in that, we can't go back to before humans were because we're here. And so where are we going to go? And so this idea of living maybe more like using, but it's marketing it within this capitalist system. How is that? Do you think that's possible, or what are you going towards, basically?
I mean,
that
is a huge question. I think that there's a scientific answer to it in terms of what we're trying to create, which is based around what we believe is evidence to demonstrate what that land would have once looked like. So it may not just be pollen samples, it may be historical records, it may be just looking at it now and saying, well, there's a lot of deep soil here with bracken in it, and that will have been a woodland at one time, and it will have been an oak birch woodland because of where it is. So there's a kind of scientific approach, but we don't really know. So in some ways it's a bit of a guess. So I fully understand Archie's point about ecological restoration. What are we restoring it to? I think added to that, you have the problem of a woodland that was there 1,000 years ago. Would it need to be the same now as it was then? Because so many things have changed. And so the answer is no, it shouldn't be. So Cryford, that is the goal there. That's a particular site, and let's make it what we think it used to be like. Our other sites, we're looking at it slightly differently. And you have to factor into that, this idea of the climate change. So even, that's different, and that's changing every year now. So we're already considering, should we plant that tree or should we plant this tree? What's the idea of a native tree? Why is sycamore non-native in Scotland? Why is Scots pine seen as non-native in the south of Scotland? All these sort of questions. Why don't we have yew trees in Scotland? Things that we traditionally would plant, but when we're talking about losing species like the ash, we probably need sycamore, do even need beech. So it's about thinking about things differently. And yes, getting more and more people involved, I think it will naturally evolve into something where woodlands will become more of a community resource for people to be involved with. I would hope, I think that's necessary actually. Otherwise we can be accused of being the same as a commercial forest, where it's just made there and it sits there and it isn't linked with the community. It's got nothing to do with it. Even the people who work in it don't live in the community a lot of the time, you know, because the forests are working on a cycle, aren't they? So, you know, there's people who live in Moffat who are foresters, but don't ever work in Moffat because nothing there is ready to be felled, nothing's ready to be planted, so they come all the way over here to work. So it's not, so yes, there's a better way. I certainly don't have all the answers to it, but I do feel it's about people having that engagement with the woodland and being part of it.
One more question from the floor.
Thank you. I think it's sort of related, but just a bit more about woodland management. If you're not just planting to leave the wood to sort of do its thing for infinity or forever, I guess if we've got a model of woodland management that FLS has put forward, it's very devastating. It sort of comes in and leaves sort of the apocalypse behind it. But if you're thinking about producing wood and thinning and cropping and doing that woodland management, how do you think about doing it in such a way that isn't commercially driven? It's not that the only imperative is to make money, but is actually to create a thriving, healthy forest with biodiversity. So it's, I mean, you're talking about needing to find some way of being able to do both. And I just wonder if you've got ideas about how you actually go about your woodland management. Is it horse-drawn extraction? How are you sensitive to the understory? How are you actually thinking of doing it? If you've got some ideas about that.
I think the key to it is probably the most expensive way to approach it, which is very small pockets of trees that could be used as a crop, thinned rather than clear felled, and extracted. I'd like to say non-mechanically, but that could be very difficult. So in the woodland planning stage, you're looking at how you'd have roots in there left out. Yes, issues around the understory getting damaged, certainly that could happen. But the hope would be that if you were planting 200 hectares and 5 hectares of it were commercial hardwoods, I think the impact would be minimal.
Right, we've had a flurry of online questions, so quick fire answers, Adrian. First one, surely planting by hand in a low impact way is always going to be better than using mechanical diggers.
Right. Yes.
Good, excellent.
Yes, because you haven't got issues around having heavy machinery on the hills, damaging things. You haven't got the fuel use. You haven't got any of those kind of things. We're using diggers at Corehead specifically because the hillside we're planting has a lot of bracken, and we don't want to use chemicals to treat the bracken, but we do want to get trees in the areas of bracken, and so we're using inverted bounding to make that happen. We can get a lot of trees in very quickly on that hillside using these sort of techniques, and the impact in terms of carbon, yes, there is an impact, but we're creating a vast woodland which will soon absorb any of the issues caused by the machines that were up there.
Right, thank you. And a question that probably harks back to Archie's love of cows in woodlands. The question is suggesting that they're unfamiliar with the cattle grazing in woodland. How much damage do cattle cause, and how does that damage compare to the damage caused by deer?
Yes.
Good answer. Would you elaborate, Archie, just slightly?
The long and the short is it depends on the density of cattle that you're putting in, and for the time period in which you're putting them in. So those are the main two things. And if you have cattle and they are, as it were, domesticated, then you will be able to keep track of that fairly adequately. Cattle do browse, and from that point of view, they tend to browse stuff that they like, And so you've got to watch out. For instance, if you have aspen in there, I think they'll chew that over fairly quickly compared to other stuff. So if you're arranging your woodland, then there are ways of arranging it so you know what the cattle are going to go to, and then you can prepare accordingly. I don't, basically you don't have any control over the deer, so you don't know what they're going to eat, whereas you should have some control over the cattle, especially if you're using satellite collars.
But a significant impact on natural regeneration in older woodland. It's still grazed.
Yes, of course there is, but the idea is that you would keep areas clear of cattle, so that you could do natural regeneration.
A question, I suspect, relating to a particular interest that this listener has. What do we suggest that this listener does with a small sliver of old mixed woodland to best promote diversity? Adrian.
Something like that with an established woodland. It depends if there's any sort of browsing pressure from deer and so on, but to think about it in the long term, you have to make sure you have different ages of trees. So they may already have some older trees in there, obviously, but are they going to plant some areas with young trees, young saplings, perhaps tree species that might not be there currently, but would be suitable for the ground? I think things like screefing areas can have a big impact. So if you haven't got cattle going through or anything like that, the understory in some places might be very rich. In other places, it might just be a kind of swardy grass, and you could just clear that back just with a spade, clear it back yourself, and see what comes.
And a last question then, which may or may not betray commercial confidence, but where do you source your downy willow from?
Most recently, downy willow has come from Trees Please, I believe. But we use other organisations. We use Cheviot Trees, and we use Alba as well.
Right. One last question from the floor, so we don't have any disappointed viewers and listeners.
Prior to commercial forestry, the woodland was still commercial woodland. Ancient woodland was used. It was coppiced. There was woodland pasture. Your plans for the future of your forest surely should be looking at those aspects if you want to keep it as a regenerating forest.
Yes, I agree completely. I think how we perhaps need to adapt our approach to that is that at the moment we're kind of thinking in terms of compartments when we should be thinking about the wider woodland as one big entity. So as an example, we have quite a thriving orchard at Corehead. It's a standalone orchard rather than having those trees as part of the wider woodland. It's its own area fenced off. We're also thinking that we would like to have a coppice there, hazel on the dry ground, willow on some of the wetter ground. But again, that'll be a compartment specifically for coppicing. I think the hope is that all these things at some time will merge with one another and become one big thriving woodland for all of those reasons. And I think it's an excellent point, actually. It goes back to terminology, doesn't it? But yes, I do talk in terms of native woodlands and commercial woodlands, when actually all native woodlands were commercial in the past. Of course they were. And going back to this idea of utility use, which Archie started his presentation with, that's why woodlands were maintained in the past for people's use.
Right, okay. I think that about wraps proceedings up. Thank you all for your engagement and your questions, and thanks most of all to our two presenters who've given us some really thought-provoking presentations. So, a round of applause.